Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, being brought to you by the Future of Freedom Foundation, as we do every week. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too. And just a few days from now, happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, likewise. We got a couple of different settings here. I'm here in Dallas at my brother's home for the holidays, and you're in Washington, D.C. at a hotel delivering a paper at a conference, so a little bit different setting for people here.
Yep.
And the paper is on that you're doing?
Well, it's a paper marking the almost 100th anniversary of the publication of a lesser-known book by Ludwig von Mises. It's a book called Nation, State, and Economy that appeared in 1919. And the theme was Mises' attempt to explain the causes behind the First World War and the consequences that arose from it, and the relationship between liberalism, nationalism, and the right of self-determination.
Oh, sounds good. All right. Will you be publishing the paper for people to take a look at, or how does that work?
It will be this week's article.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, well, this is Thanksgiving week, as you all know, and so we thought it would be appropriate to discuss Thanksgiving. We have our turkey dinners and we have our celebrations, but we sometimes forget what the original Thanksgiving was all about. So, Richard, why don't you give us a good synopsis? You've written on this over the years of what the first Thanksgiving really signified in terms of our libertarian philosophy.
Well, perhaps a lot of the viewers and listeners may not know this story, so if they'll bear with me for a few minutes. The Puritans were a minority group of Christians, a denomination, in Great Britain. But at that time, in the 1500s, the 1600s, religious intolerance and often persecution was still very common, including in Great Britain. And as a consequence, the Puritans felt put upon, discriminated against, not allowed to be able to articulate and live and express their interpretations of the Christian Bible. So they decided to leave what they viewed as the corruptions and tyranny of the old world and to make a new home in the new world. And they were going to sail, therefore, the famous ship, the Mayflower. They were to sail across the Atlantic and to establish a new Jerusalem in the new world. Now, interestingly enough, their targeted destination was Virginia. However, those are the old days of sailing ships, and you went where the wind and the currents took you. So that's why they actually landed at what we call Plymouth Rock in today's Massachusetts. This was not their intended location. But anyway, they arrived there in the early 1600s, 1620 approximately, and they established the Plymouth colony. Now, interestingly enough, all those who joined signed what was called the Plymouth Compact. And this basically was the rules and procedures and institutional setup on how they would live and interact with each other. And they had concluded that the sinfulness, the corruption of the old world was connected with private property. Private property focused on self-interest. It separated one person from another. It made people materialistic. So therefore, what they were going to do is they were going to create a community that would follow the ideal of Plato's Republic, the ancient Greek philosopher, Plato's Republic, in terms of the guardians. The guardians in Plato's famous book, The Republic, share all things in common. There is no private property. There's no private ownership of the means of production. They all dress alike. They all eat in barracks-like facilities. Marriage is even abolished for them, because you see that would tie you self-interestedly to your child or to your spouse. So, in fact, when nature moved the men and women of the guardian class, this is Plato's conception in the book, to have intimate relations, and through those intimate relations there was the conception of a little person. At a very early age, in Plato's conception, the child would be taken away and raised in a government orphanage in ancient Athens, so that the parents would lose a concern for the child as opposed to their interest in the common good of the society, and the child would be brought up only knowing that his parents was the city-state. Well, that was the mindset of Plato. But anyway, the Puritans did not go that far. There were men and wives. You had your own kids. But the fact is, what they did is they cleared the land, and they decided to work it in common. They would harvest and share all in common. And the work affairs of the colony, and of course that was back then with a far more sort of a gender-related division of labor. The women were doing the cooking, the women were cleaning the clothes, family clothes and things, and that would even be done in common. They're sharing cooking, sharing in eating, sharing in doing the chores and so on. And the idea was that this would create a wider brotherhood of not only virtuous behavior and attitude, but prosperity, because all would be working for the group. Now, how did this turn out? This is all told in the diary of Governor Bradford. He was the elder of the Plymouth colony who had been nominated and appointed as the governor to oversee the affairs of the colony. And now, what does he relate? Well, the fact is that after the first year, almost half of the colony had died of starvation, as well as the elements. Now, this went on, and now for a second year, they had a failure and of crops, not much work done, and even more people died. So now Bradford relates that the elders of the colony got together and said, if there's one more year like this, one more harvest weather cycle like this, everybody's going to be devastated. That the colony will disappear in the wilderness. That they were therefore going to try something different. Rather than communal ownership, communal work, communal egalitarian sharing, they would try an idea of taking the colony's land that they had laid out and partly cleared, and divide them into family plots. And each family in the colony would be able to grow whatever crop they decided to grow. They could bring it to harvest. Whatever they harvested would now be their personal family or private property to use and consume as they saw fit. And if they had surpluses, a larger harvest of wheat than they particularly needed, or perhaps they had raised some hogs, for example, or chickens, and they had more of the produce of that than they personally and the family needed, they would be free now to trade their surpluses for the surpluses of their neighbors. Now, what does Bradford recount with this introduction of private property and free enterprise, if you will? He says, whereas before the men, when it was collective work, some men would show up early and try to be industrious. Others showed up late and later in the day and were lackadaisical in their work. And this had created envy and resentment. The industrious members of the community said, why should I work hard when this fellow shows up late, doesn't really put his shoulder to the effort, and yet he's going to have an equal share as me? And the women were complaining. Why should I be washing this husband's shirts? He's dirtier than my husband. Or why can't I cook what my family wants rather than a collective eating arrangement? Now, what Bradford relates, all of this now changed. The husband and the sons would go out to the field that they had cleared as their family farm, and they would rise up early with the sunrise and work until the daylight hours ended, clearing, tending, fertilizing, watching over, planting, and the harvests were now bountiful on these individual farms, Bradford relates. The women happily were caring for their own homes, milking the cows, churning the butter, taking care of the utensils and implements around the home, and so on, darning socks and so on. And so what he explains in the diary is that now at the end of this third year, rather than famine and starvation, they had this bountiful crop. As people were growing food and raising animals on their own land, sharing their surpluses with each other, And they decided that now that having now been saved in the wilderness, they would show a thanks to God, Jacob, and they would hold a feast to celebrate their survival for their New Jerusalem in the New World. And they not only had such a bountifulness for themselves, they could now invite members of the neighboring Indian tribes that lived in the surrounding forests to join them, both to trade and to share in the meals. And this is basically the beginning of Thanksgiving. When I tell this story, when I remember to my students in class at this time of the year, I always tell them that when they sit around at home now to celebrate Thanksgiving, and the turkey is being carved up, and the yams and the stuffing and the cranberries being passed around, that they should recall that what they're really sharing and celebrating is not just a family gathering that's become a tradition in America, but what they're celebrating is the birth of private property and free enterprise. That is the birth of capitalism in America. And from that beginning has come the prosperity that we take for granted in our country today.
Yeah, that's a great summary of what happened. Yeah, there's two things that stand out for me. One is that these people were really motivated in large part by religious considerations. I mean, they sat there and said, you know, it's right to share with others, it's right to care for others, to show compassion for others, and so we're going to establish a system where everybody is sharing and sharing alike, this communal system. And ironically, it ends up with starvation. And
Yes.
that when they go to a system of private property that says you can keep everything you earn, all of a sudden there's this tremendous bounty. And out of that comes the idea that people can then be generous and compassionate toward others because they got stuff left over from what they have produced. So that you have a system where people are free to keep what they earn, but then are free to do what they want with it. And that generally, in most people, turns out to be part of that extra bounty converted into generosity and compassion and help, donations and so forth. And the other thing that stands out is that this really is like a communist system that we've seen in the 20th century and the 21st century. I mean, everybody was mandated to participate in this system, and you know it results in starvation. And yet, Richard, we see the same starvation today. We see North Korea, we see Venezuela, we see Cuba that has this massive system of government ownership of everything. Everybody works for the common good. Everybody works for the state. And the result is massive starvation. So it's just so obvious that there's so many people around the world that have still not gotten this message. I mean, it's incredible. Some, 400 or 500 years later, people are still doing the same thing. When here, the answer is clear. If you want to end poverty in a country, then you've got to establish a necessary prerequisite of this is a private property order, where people are free to keep everything they earn. In that kind of system, then people start getting wealthy. That enables them to help the needy, the poor, the churches, the organizations that are out helping the poor. People have money to donate to those organizations. But when everybody's on the verge of starvation, the people that are going to suffer the most are the poor, the disadvantaged, and the needy, because nobody's got enough money to help them out. Everybody's starving and vying for survival in that kind of society.
Yeah, the problem that arises, looking at the wider picture, if you will, is the failure to realize that the relationships that may often be appropriate and workable within the household or the family is not applicable to the wider setting of the society. Now, for example, you're visiting a relative in Dallas for Thanksgiving. I think it's your sister. Am I correct about that?
Sister and brother.
Okay. Now,
and a niece.
Are they charging you rent for the room you're using and a fee for the meal? For your plate of Thanksgiving food? No,
not yet.
Not yet. See, you put that idea in their head, it's all over. And within the household, we think of, mom and dad realizing that certain things need to be done around the house. The father mows the yard. He does some repair out on the porch. The kids, sort of maybe take care of something else in the yard. The mother does this, that, and the other. And within the household, we take for granted that there is if you will, a degree of communal sharing and collaborative effort. And certainly anyone who's grown up in a family knows that that doesn't make it hunky-dory. Why did I get assigned this task as opposed to my brother or sister? And why did my dad say my brother or sister did a better job than me, so they get the extra ice cream portion at dinner? I mean, all of those things go on. But the fact is, within the family household, there is this sort of common goals that people sort of collaboratively participate in. The error is it's idea that you can extend from the household to the wider setting of society, and when that is done, this causes the problems. The common sharing and affection and common goals of the mom and the dad and the children, and maybe some extended families like grandparents who may share in the house, is inapplicable to the wider society in which you deal with other families, other individuals, other strangers in different settings. And in fact, when you extend the communal participation of the family to the greater society, it is a disaster. As to be honest, if you took the market arrangements of the wider society and applied it to the family in every way, the way you take for granted, well, I buy this cup of coffee, I purchase this at Ace Hardware, I buy my shirts at this department store, and so on, it would be disastrous. So in fact, there's different settings. The other thing about the family is that it's voluntary. Now, sometimes when you're growing up, you don't feel it's voluntary as a kid. Why do I have to do this? I'm going to run away from home, and they'll be sorry. But the fact is that it's voluntary. Whereas once you extend this notion of the family as a communal household to the society as a whole, there'll be so many differences of value, purposes, goals, meanings, desires, that to try to impose one set of goals and values on everyone will necessarily require you to extend this relationship to incorporate compulsion and force as well. In the household, you sort of agree things. Doesn't always mean you like what you agree to, but you agree to it, and this participatory process. If you extend it to the society as a whole with the diversity of values, purposes, meanings, and goals, there's no way that you can avoid the imposition of coercion to impose one set of families' goals and purposes on everyone, and within that one family, their notion of apportioning tasks to the compulsory allocation and commanding of tasks to everyone.
All right, Richard, but look, you can't deny that Marx was right with respect to exploitation of labor within the family. I mean, look, parents got their kids out mowing the lawn and doing chores and paying them $1, like with allowance, and the poor kid doesn't know that $1 is minimal compared to all this labor that he's doing. I mean, we definitely need the government to stop this exploitation of labor, don't you think, within the family?
Well, the problem is that we have forgotten in-kind payments for services rendered. Oh, Dad, I need the car to take my girlfriend to the movies. Oh, does the dad charge him for the car? Does Mom charge for each extra portion of the mashed potatoes? There's in-kind payment for services rendered. Now, the other thing is that you have to realize, and this is really the economist in me, is that in the household, children are consumer goods for the parents. I mean, you have to buy them clothes, you have to buy them food, they want toys, then you have to do things for school, then you pay for their education if you can, and so on and so forth out of your own pocket. And what happens? Then they grow up and leave, and you never see them again. So it's like going to Disneyland. Oh, it's a wonderful time, and I like having my picture taken with Mickey, and I know I'm going to spend hundreds of dollars, and then I go home, but I don't feel bad about it. I put some money aside. I had a nice vacation. That's what it is with kids. They cost money, but they have pleasure. Oh, look at Johnny. It's his first steps. Oh, look at Johnny. He's eating by himself with his spoon. Oh, so kids are like consumer items. They're like toys that you pay money to enjoy. But they don't really give you anything other than they might respect you occasionally and give you a kiss goodnight, and that's it. Yeah, so kids are just consumer goods, and you expect to just give them things for free, which are costing you money.
Yeah, but you're ignoring something important, is that kids call home regularly asking for more. And so
Oh, yes. And once they don't need more, they never call home again.
oh, wait a minute. They always need more. I mean, your suggestion that as soon as they get out of school, that's it. I think a lot of parents would disagree with you. Now, I think that raises an important notion, though, of what we call the welfare state, which,
Right.
of course, is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, education grants, SBA loans, the whole concept of the government, or what is denominated society, helping each other out. Because, I mean, this is really a variation, I think, of what was going on at Plymouth Rock. You have this system where people can sort of keep what they earn, subject to the IRS and subject to whatever percentage the government wants to take. I mean, in a sense, by adopting the federal income tax and the welfare state, and also the national security state, the government ended up owning the results of production, and then they let people have an allowance effectively by having the power to determine the percentage of the income tax that's going to be set. But this whole system is based on mandatory charity, which is really not charity at all. There's no way you can have a real meaning, genuine meaning of the term charity when it's mandated, when people are forced to do so. And before Social Security, for example, was adopted, people could rely on their children to help them out when their senior years, when they got sick, when they couldn't manage. And this was an opportunity for children to repay, in a sense, all the things that their parents had done for them. And now you've got this government system that's dispersonal, it's bureaucratic, where people say, oh, I put it in, I got a right to take it back. But they're not getting their own money back. Their money was spent a long time ago. Social Security has been a welfare program from the very beginning, and it is based on fleecing young people by force instead of letting young people have the opportunity to help out their parents in need. So you've got this massive coercive system that I think destroys this sense of generosity and compassion and caring, and it really reflects a lack of trust in both freedom and in people. I mean, when you have a genuinely free society, people are free to decide what to do with their own money. So they can decide whether to help the church or to help the March of Dimes or to help their parents. But that's what free will, that's what freedom of choice is really all about. Having that right and that opportunity to grow and mature and make these choices. The whole welfare state concept destroys that because it's all based on coercion and force. And while it doesn't cause mass starvation as a purely communist society would do, or as what happened in Plymouth Rock, it certainly lowers people's standard of living on an overall sense, and of course, thereby damaging and hurting those at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Yeah, and besides the material negative effects, I think we should never discount or not give emphasis to its impact on the moral character of people. When is a moral decision relevant or meaningful? When a person can say either yes or no. If you're compelled to do, quote, the right thing, then it's not your choice. You have been threatened perhaps with force or a threat literally to your life, and therefore you have externally acted in a way that you may well not have acted if such a threat of violence had not been either explicitly or implicitly looking you right over the shoulder. Now, therefore, a moral act, an ethical act, an act that is viewed as right and reasonable, is only an act where the actor himself had to weigh the alternatives and decide in his mind, this is the better thing, the good thing, the right thing, the virtuous thing, the ethical thing to do, when in fact he could choose not to. When you take away that element to moral decision making, that is freedom of choice, you not only make it amoral, that is, it's just an act you've been commanded to do, but it also eliminates the ability for people to exercise and develop this sense of ethical character, Well, if something is not done, or if a helping hand is not given to someone, or if I don't participate in some community or social activity, some desirable result might not be forthcoming. The individual then is put in the position of deciding and having to weigh what is the right thing to do, what is the more important thing to do, what am I really willing to forego or give up by using my time and resources, money in some other direction, rather than this one, which one part of me says is good and right to do. So the individual, by having to make these choices, develops through literal exercise of it, his moral sense and moral character. Take away those opportunities to have to make those choices, and you unmoralize people. I didn't say demoralize, that's a different issue, but you unmoralize them, because you can't have a sense of moral choice unless the individual has to weigh the alternatives and decide what is the right thing to do.
That's a great point. I mean, I look at the conscience as sort of like a muscle. And if you stop exercising your conscience, it's going to atrophy. And I think that's what the welfare state has done to all too many people. Why should I help that person? The government's there. That's what the government's job is. And when the conscience is not exercised, as you point out, which would happen in a totally, genuinely free society where the government doesn't have any mandatory charity, people would have to be exercising this muscle. Now, people often accuse us libertarians of being heartless because we want to abolish these mandatory charity programs and we want to leave people free to make these choices on their own. But, in a genuinely free society, Richard, people can go out and establish communes just like they did at Plymouth Rock. They can do so voluntarily. Interestingly enough, the times they've tried to implement these plans, I think there was one in New Harmony, Indiana, they end up going broke, even on a voluntary basis.
Yes.
And let's face it, there's very few activities like this. I mean, let's take a nunnery, a place where all these Catholic nuns get together. It's very rare to find a nunnery that is totally self-sufficient. I mean, I've read where sometimes they have their crops and their gardens and stuff, but I'm 99% certain that mostly what they're relying on is donations from other people in the society. I mean, that's the way the church gets funded. The Catholic Church gets funded through donations. They're not a self-operating business. So it's in everybody's interest, especially these people that are helping the poor and the needy or doing religious work. It's in their interest that there's this massive amount of wealth that's being produced in the other sector of society, because the more people have, the more they're able to give. Now, there's no guarantee they'll do that. I mean, that's one of the risks of freedom. But there's no question that when society has a very limited amount of wealth, the people that are out doing that kind of work are going to have a much lower standard of living than in a society where there is massive amount of wealth being produced. Let me give you an example of this. If you take a nun in, say, Guatemala, who has taken a vow of poverty, I guarantee you that the same nun, a different nun, who has taken the exact same vow of poverty, is living a much higher standard of living here in the United States than her counterpart in Guatemala. Better facilities, better sleeping facilities, better food, better automobile, better access to food and other clothing and the rest of the thing. It's just the spillover effect that takes place in a society where there is more wealth being produced as compared to a society where there is minimal wealth being produced.
Yes, and I think that we should also appreciate that this voluntarism that we're speaking about is not just to give this element of moral character and incentive for work, but it creates the opportunity for creative discovery, by which I mean, if the government does the charitable work, it basically monopolizes it. We're a good part of it. It gets the money it needs to undertake these programs by compulsory taxation. And every dollar that the government devotes to what it calls welfare charity is $1 less in the pockets of the citizenry. And as they have less dollars in their pockets, the consequence is they have fewer chances to evaluate, well, what would be good works for me to do, and how might this goal be achieved? In other words, when there's competition through charity, you have people deciding, is this the best way to help the poor? Is this the best way to advance some worthy cause? And therefore you set multiple minds at work to devise appropriate and effective and results-oriented means to achieve the charitable end, as opposed to government monopolizing it through tax dollars and saying, this is the way we're going to try it, this is the way it's going to happen and be done, an end of story, regardless of how unsuccessful the outcomes constantly seem to be. In the marketplace, a businessman opens an enterprise. He has a vision as to what to produce and how to produce it and what he thinks consumers would be willing to pay for it. If he successfully makes a profit, if he's unsuccessful, he goes out of business. And even if he's somewhat profitable, the market does not preclude another person from saying, you know what, I think I can make a better version of that product. I can offer it at a better price. I can be more cost efficient to increase my profit margin, not by getting consumers to pay more for the good, but by lowering my expenses to bring it to market, and therefore outsell him that way in increasing my profit margin. It allows different voices and ideas to try to achieve the goal. And we expect this, right? So this is what we get from a creative, open society in which minds are set free to do this in various ways in the marketplace in the narrow sense. Well, the same logic applies to this wider social sense. Put many minds to work with many avenues of resources and common organizations of competing, how to help the poor, how to get the deserving people better housing, clothing, skill training, to make them, hopefully looking down the road, self-supporting. But when the government monopolizes this, we shut off the potential of devising better ways to solve the very charitable and social concerns that many of us have in society. And if I can just make one other point that we both talked about a few minutes ago, that this idea, when the government takes it over, it diminishes the moral personal sense. A couple of years ago, Der Spiegel magazine, that's the German weekly news magazine, had an article in which they interviewed some leading German corporate businessmen, asking them how much charitable work did they, or through the corporate structure, give to solve social problems in society. Virtually all of these German corporate executives says, that is not my concern. That's the government. That's what my company and I pay taxes for. It's not my responsibility. Well, then you have created an institutional setting in which people become desensitized to the circumstances of their fellow men as a personal matter, and their sense of a moral obligation, great or small, or in one way or another, to offer that assistance themselves. Now compare that to America. The United States has a heavy welfare state, and government regulates things, and people are always complaining about what's left as take-home pay in their checks. But in America, to the extent that we have greater degrees of financial and other types of freedom than, let's say, in Germany and other European countries, we are the most generous country in the world. Private giving in 2017, the last year for which the full data is obviously available, in 2017, close to $1 trillion was given by Americans in private charity, either cash donations or equivalent in-kind time of their own effort to serve these good causes. That is a lot of money, of either cash or in-kind giving. That's because we still have this sense of voluntarism in America, which unfortunately has been greatly lost in places like Germany, as reflected in the thinking and the attitudes of those corporate German businessmen.
Yeah, that's a fine note. And on that fine note, we need to wrap things up. And I want to wish y'all a very happy Thanksgiving. We greatly appreciate your support at FFF, and we really wish you all the best for the holiday. And Richard, a happy Thanksgiving to you and your family.
And happy Thanksgiving to you and to our viewers and listeners. And remember, when you're eating that turkey, you are celebrating the birth of capitalism in America. So tell your family members that.
Happy Thanksgiving to y'all, and we'll see you next week.